Welcome all to Earnscliff's ongoing Canada in Uncertain Times webinar series. We're here today to talk about Americans' Choice, analysis of the 2020 American election and the way forward. My name is Alan Gregg. I'm one of 40 principals at the Earnscliff Strategy Group. For those of you who might not be familiar with our company, we're a public affairs strategy and advisory company with specializations in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. I'm joined today by a couple of colleagues and a guest. Sarah Goldfeder is a former staffer in the U.S. Embassy, expat American, now living in Ottawa, and our resident expert on trade and Canada-U.S. relations. Rick Anderson, bi-coastal Vancouver and Ottawa, old friend, old colleague, spends a lot of time in the resource sector and resource files and brings kind of a very interesting perspective in terms of Canada-U.S. relations as well. And a returning guest, our friend Rod Shaw, who is the chairman and principal at the Alpine Group, one of the top government relations consulting firms in the world, based in Washington, D.C. I think today he's in lovely Parkland. Is that right, Rod?
Park City.
Park City, close.
Park City, Utah. So usually DC.
There you go. I should mention before anything else happens that you will notice on the bottom of your screen is a Q&A. You're free to ask questions to either an individual panel members or the panelists as a whole. Sarah will be monitoring the questions as they come in. We've had some in advance for the first time, interestingly. Very interesting ones as well, and that will stop the flow of our conversation to entertain those as we go along. But before we start our conversation, we're going to call in our resident Americaphile, a political junkie, Charles Bird, just to kind of set the table in terms of where we are right now and what we might be looking at in terms of the political landscape.
Well, thank you, Alan, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I have prepared a short series of slides just to remind folks at home of exactly what they know all too well after countless hours of watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or whatever your chosen poison is. First off, the popular vote. This is likely chiefly of interest to President Trump, given his fascination with numbers dating back to 2016. The Biden-Harris ticket has secured more votes than any other ticket in American presidential history. That is quite an accomplishment. I will say at the same time that President Trump has increased his vote count by almost 6 million votes over 2016. So it's been a very competitive race, as I'm sure many folks have noticed. The margin currently sits at roughly 3.5 million votes, and how those are distributed is obviously very significant. Just a quick look at the 2016 numbers. You'll note that Hillary Clinton led Donald Trump in the popular vote by more than 2 points. Biden now leads Trump by 2.5 points. The big difference between 2020 and 2016, in 2016, there were two other viable presidential candidates who had quite an effect on vote counts in various states. And this time around, it really is a head-up Democratic versus Republican fight between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So here's the current state of the race. You'll notice that there are really, with apologies to Alaska, which hasn't formally been declared or been called, I think most people can safely assume it's in the Republicans' column. We have 5 states at play. They are Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. They are in various stages of their counts. Some, like Georgia, are very close. Others, like Pennsylvania and Nevada, may stretch out to this Saturday before we have a complete vote tally from those respective states. You'll notice that in terms of states that have been called, shall we say, as opposed to declared, Biden enjoys a considerable lead at the moment of 253 electoral college votes versus 217 electoral college votes for Donald Trump. So paths to victory. There's no doubt that for Joe Biden, it's pretty straightforward at this point. If he is able to secure both Nevada and Arizona for a total of 17 electoral college votes, He will be at 270 and subject to various legal challenges or potential recounts in some states like Wisconsin. 270 is in fact the magic number to become president of the United States. Now, that's the clearest path to victory, without a doubt. Now, Georgia is still very much in play. We're down to the short strokes with 99% of the vote reporting. Trump holding on to a lead of less than 15,000 votes. North Carolina, a little more certain for Trump at this point, although, as has been noted many times, let the votes be counted and let the final tally speak. Pennsylvania, very, very fascinating. Trump still enjoying a more than 100,000 vote lead, but a lot of the ballots that have yet to be counted are essentially early voting and from largely Democratic supporting areas such as Philadelphia and the suburbs. So there is every possibility that Joe Biden could in fact take over in Pennsylvania and surpass Donald Trump, although it's clearly going to be close. That's also true in Georgia. So let's just say for a second that Biden does in fact win Georgia and wins Pennsylvania and wins Arizona and wins Nevada. That leaves him at 306 electoral college votes versus 232 for Donald Trump. So that would be a fairly convincing win, not nearly as convincing as some Democrats had hoped, which the so-called repudiation of the Trump's presidency, that clearly didn't happen. So for Donald Trump, the path to victory is much more narrow. Essentially, he absolutely has to win Pennsylvania. He absolutely has to win Georgia. We're going to assume that he's all right in North Carolina. He must thereafter win one or both of Nevada or Arizona. So he has, of the 5 remaining states that are still in play, Trump has to win 4 of them, with Pennsylvania being probably the most important, likewise Georgia. So just a quick word about what's happening down ballot. There had been a lot of hopes that the Democrats would retake the Senate. That has not happened. What you see is they were able to flip Senate seats in Arizona and in Colorado, but they lost one in Alabama, and Georgia and North Carolina haven't quite worked out. North Carolina is too close to call. Georgia will involve a runoff, but the expectation is that the Republicans will be successful there when the runoff in fact happens. So right now we have a tied Senate. It'd be interesting if we ended up with a 50-50 tie, because whoever the next vice president would be will be the one to determine that. But it feels at the moment like the Republicans will hold on to the Senate, which obviously has big implications going forward. And in terms of the House, a decidedly interesting result, which is to say that the Democrats managed to take 2 away from the Republicans, but the Republicans managed to take 8 away from the Democrats. So while the Democrats will still control the House of Representatives, the Republicans actually did quite well. Now there's still 36 seats that are too close to call, but it's unlikely that the Democrats will be giving up control of the House of Representatives. But it also speaks to the fact that the Biden campaign had relatively short coattails when it came to the Congress. So I'll just stop there and throw it back to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Charles. You can go back to doing your Daniel Day-Lewis interpretation of Abraham Lincoln now.
You read my mind. Thank you, everyone.
Sarah, I want to start with you. I mean, you've been involved with and participating in presidential elections for a long time. I mean, here we are 40 hours after the poll closed. We have no idea what the outcome is with any kind of certainty. There's all kinds of procedures that could follow, even when we do know that. How unusual is the situation that we're in right now, and how dire is it, I guess, is the other question.
Well, I think it's fair to say it's unusual. I also think it's fair to characterize it as expected. I think that this was very much the outcome in many ways that both the Republicans and the Democrats knew was coming. Everyone has urged patience. And I think that you also see the preparation of all the legal teams has come to fruition on a number of cases that have been filed in different states. And the outcome of those will really determine the timeline, I think, on how long it takes us to actually get to a point where we can definitively say that somebody has won enough electoral votes to go to actually become president. But I mean, I think that the question, there's an underlying question of the overall damage that an election like this does to a democracy where you have a lot of the electorate not trusting the system, not trusting the individuals that are in charge of the system. So I think that there is some concern overall about how we recover and recuperate after this election. But as far as the actual outcome is concerned, I think there is a sense, I think, overall that people are being patient and waiting for every vote to be counted.
I want to get Rod and Rick's first impression too. I mean, Rod, you ever seen anything like this? And are you worried about the situation that America's in right now?
Well, if you go back from about 2000 to now, it's very rare the election is called on election night. I mean, so the question is whether it's you go to bed at midnight Eastern Standard Time and you know who the president is. That's actually not the norm on one front. On the other hand, I think Sarah touches exactly on the right thing, which is, but the psychology underlying this election for both camps is much more vitriolic, is much more ready to be inflamed. And so not having a clear, decisive answer, whether it was on election night or whether it's tomorrow or whether it's a month from now after the courts have worked their magic, leaves everyone uncomfortable. So some people think the election's being stolen. Some people think it's rigged up front because it's hard to actually participate in voting. Everyone has their own perspectives on how this works. So it's unique in my mind because of how supercharged the environment is. Voters are looking at this as a worldview. This is not about, do I think my tax policy should change on the margins a bit? It's really about what world do you see America occupy, what space it has locally and internationally. And so when somebody doesn't agree with you, that's really hard to reconcile. And that's unique, I think.
Rick, the Dow Jones is up again today, over 5 points in the last 4 days, 5 percentage points. I mean, do they know something that I don't know? I'm getting ulcers. They seem to think everything is terrific. What's your sense of where we're at right now?
Well, it's hard to pull all the different ingredients out of the market. I mean, there's so much stimulus being applied, both fiscally and monetary policy, that the markets and assets in general have been pushed up in value quite a lot. And some of that's intentional by the president. So what do they see? They see that neither one of these candidates has really got a strong mandate to change that. I mean, if Biden ends up winning, as you know, it sort of looks like he's going to do narrowly right now, he hasn't exactly got a clear path for a radical new fiscal approach. So I guess the markets are kind of looking for a continuation of things and seriously discounting the idea that there's going to be chaos and instability right now.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that the markets have any wisdom. I'm just saying that, you hear anecdotally prospects of civil war, all kinds of, and I just wanted to know whether in your sense of things, that's overblown. That, we'll figure this out. We'll get through it.
I don't think we're going to have violence, if that's what you're referring to particularly. I mean, there may be some demonstrations that get messy on the weekends and stuff like that, but to my eye, that's not what's happening here. But there is a reinforced, I mean, the president not only didn't get repudiated, he got reinforced. He got more votes. He got a higher percentage of the vote than he had the last time. So you can either say that's an endorsement of Trump, or maybe it's an endorsement of the Republican Party, or maybe it's a repudiation of what the Democrats are offering for the second election in a row. I think there's a big ingredient in that, both candidate-wise and probably content-wise. But I also think, and I think this is probably the more permanent piece of what we're looking at, and one that neither party has really got a solution to, or at least not a particularly attractive solution to. And that's at both left and right for 20 years now. There's been a growing group of disaffected voters who feel left out of society, left out of the economy. It expresses itself as Occupy or Black Lives Matter on the left, if I can put it that way, as the Tea Party, and Trumpism on the right. And those things look like they're both here to stay. And they're both kind of at the extremes, if you will, of the political spectrum, whereas most voters are more in the middle, but there's no party that speaks to the middle. They're both having to respond to these wings.
Rick, you've just answered the next 6 questions I had to ask, but that's not neither here nor there. Rod, walk us through what happens next. I mean, what steps are most likely to be made, and how long is it going to take before we have any kind of definitive sense of what this outcome is going to be?
Well, first up is each state's final, accounting. So we are, as Charles noted at the outset, we're waiting for final counts out of Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona. And then there will also be challenges, most likely, we're seeing, for states that the president and his team thinks were close enough, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so that will take some time to play itself out legally. Some states have automatic recounts. If you're within a certain margin, it's just an automatic recount to ensure that the votes were adequately accounted for. So the conventional wisdom in a non-conventional moment is that we're looking at, suits being filed this week, next week, and them taking several weeks to work their way through the various systems where they're filed. And so I think most of us in Washington think that the earliest you really have lockdown cases adjudicated is Thanksgiving, 3-4 weeks out, and many may take longer than that, depending on how the cases play out, what the votes count look like. At the same time, underneath that, there is kind of an acceptance, at least from the conversations I've had across Democrat, Republican, House, Senate, and around town, that the outcome is kind of known. I think people do know the president is going to challenge, the Republicans will challenge. I've not really talked to a lot of folks who have said, and I'm positive this is going to work. Like we've seen the evidence, we know the spot we're going to point to that is going to change things. So I think there's a kind of a sense of it's a mission to try to see if they can find remedy that they like. But I really am not talking to a lot of folks who go, yep, this election is not going to end up being Joe Biden's. This does feel as if at the moment, barring something unexpected, some other kind of development we're just not aware of. We talked before we got on here, if there's suddenly a county that actually someone goes, whoops, we totally forgot to count this county in one of those 4 or 5 states. I mean, that could change things significantly, but if they go kind of according to the script at the moment, I think we're thinking 3-4 weeks before we really know.
I want to just go back to Rick, because I cut you off a little bit, but it's an important point that you were making there. I mean, few saw him coming in 2016. It seems like we've, again, wildly underestimated the appeal that Donald Trump has to vast swaths of America. I mean, what does his continued strength say about American politics writ large and American political culture today? You're muted.
Is that for me?
Yeah, and then I'm going to ask Sarah to just comment on that as well.
Well, I mean, I touched on it. I think there is a large disaffected body of voters who feels, as both Bernie and Trump expressed it in the primary season, and Trump throughout his tenure. Sorry. Let's go to somebody else for a minute.
Go back on mute. Sarah, you comment. I mean, you're expat American. I mean, you grew up in America. Is the America you're seeing today decidedly different? Has it been a significant cultural shift in that land?
It's different, but it's the same. I think that there's been a trajectory that I think we've felt throughout the last generation. A lot of the dissension and the issues that we have that are manifesting themselves through the Black Lives Matter movement and through Occupy Wall Street. Those are issues that existed well before Donald Trump became a political candidate. And so I think there are a lot of these things that are historic and systemic. And I also think that we have, all these new technologies, that there's this ability for connectivity across the country in ways that we didn't necessarily see in the past. And so what a group of people who are sitting together in one corner of the country and thinking is a big deal now becomes something that becomes a big deal nationally, not just regionally. And so I think that there are a couple of different factors that feed into that. But I think underlying all of it is this lack of trust that I think really has infiltrated the United States political, the media conversation, and the conversation about government, that there's nobody out there that is categorically trusted by all Americans. And I think that is something that has left us with a bit of a hole, and makes it very easy for the president to point out his reality, and others to point out the mistruths or a different reality, and it's very hard for a lot of Americans to sort out what it is in that experience that resonates within their own experience. And so I think that that's a lot of the disconnect that we see right now.
You've also been monitoring sorry, Rick, you lost your chance to talk because of Fido. You're turn around and go in that corner for 35 seconds. Go on. Sorry.
COVID life. What's always struck me as interesting is there's a common theme at the disaffected extremes, both right and left, and it's that you're getting screwed by the system. They, whoever they are, don't care about you. They look after themselves, the elites, the media, the gatekeepers, the politicians, the blah, 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 big business. And that they don't care about the little person. And those people are getting, both Trump, who really comes from that world, and Sanders, who's been a lifetime politician, basically appeal to that and speak to it. And there's a lot of people on both. There's a lot of people on both sides who subscribe to it. And not only that, there's some evidence that they're right. That people are being left behind. There's an underclass, a permanent underclass forming, where social mobility is not what it used to be. That the opportunity to be anything you wish to be is not as true as it used to be, and that public policy is often expressed in very narrow cast, basically selfish terms for an industry or a group of voters, whether they're sometimes this kind of voter or that kind of voter. It's a tug of war, and it's become a zero-sum game. You win, I lose, rather than what we used to look for was the common weal, the common good, the commonwealth. That's become a corny, abandoned phrase that Biden tried to speak to, the soul of the nation in the campaign, but it didn't resonate. He's not particularly credible in speaking for it. Another lifetime career politician offering a fairly bland, non-radical set of ideas, not even particularly a strong platform.
No, I mean, in fact, there's an argument that virtually nothing has changed in this election, that whatever different results have occurred as a consequence of very idiosyncratic things that relate to the local area. But anyway, Sarah, you've been monitoring.
To me, the word replay really resonates here, 2020 versus 2016.
Sarah, you've been monitoring questions from listeners. Anything there that you want to raise, either to an individual panelist or the whole panel?
Yeah, there's a couple. And actually, there's one that came in before that I also see has also been put in the chat. And I just ask all of our viewers to please put questions in Q&A rather than chat. But it's kind of for you in a way, Alan. One of the questions is this the end of polling as we know it? Because there's a sense that the polls that came in advance of the election were not reflected in the actual results. And kind of a related question that we've also got in early is on these issues that divided the vote. Was this a pocketbook issue election, or was this a philosophical election? And Rod had started to speak to that earlier, but he also spoke about it earlier before we had the rest of the guests on to hear. And I think it might be really instructive to hear about what some of the dissension between a philosophical viewpoint that may align yourself with the a Biden vote, but actually turned into a Trump vote because of certain issues. I think that's something that there's a couple of questions that would address that.
You want to start with that, Rod, and then I'll do a little bit on the polling?
Sure. I mean, I think what is interesting is Democrats are morose that it was not a repudiation election. They were looking for a huge electoral college vote. They were looking for a huge popular vote. That didn't happen. And so they cast the blame outward at the voters who they don't understand how they couldn't have seen what they think are character flaws, maybe inhumane when you think about things like immigration policy, et cetera, that they thought was so clear and decisive in their mind. What I think is interesting is that there's so far, at least in the first 48, 72 hours, not been a lot of looking inward going, if Trump is so abhorrent to so many people that you think should have obviously come to you, why didn't they? And the answer may be because where you stand was not sufficiently appealing. And one of the places on that, I think, was the defund the police movement, where you heard, and I've talked to a lot of Democrats who've said it's a bad bumper sticker for the broader politics. Everyone's focused on the suburban voter. That's where they think the elections swing in the United States. The average suburban person probably is not walking around saying, I want to eliminate the police department. People believe in reform. They recognize there needs to be all sorts of training. There's lots of things to go to, but eliminate was not the word. And when that was both what Democrats said or their associated bases were articulating, there were a lot of voters. And as I've talked to people kind of around the country in various forums, there's a lot of folks who say, look, I dislike the president personally, but his policies are things I can go with. But it was also really, what do I think about the alternative? Is the alternative appealing to me? And so some people may have made that decision around physical safety. Some people may have made that around pocketbook issues. I had people talking to me about tax policy and wow, they were worried about what a radical left would do on tax. I mean, there's all sorts of element here. And that's why I think Rick and Alan may be right about the fact that in some ways this is a stasis election, because there was no one clear movement of, yes, there's an overwhelming sense of we're going to change our trajectory as a nation coming out of this election. The one thing that is fundamentally different today is who gets the bully pulpit. That is actually about the only major difference. It's going to be hard to legislate. It's hard to do a lot of things unilaterally, but Biden will have a template, a platform to be able to speak that is a different message than what Trump had. And that's where our starting point for debates, discussions will now be different because of who holds the White House, assuming he ends up, being sworn in on the 20th. That's the biggest change, but the fights underneath were not clarified and not remedied in this election.
Just a couple of words on the polls, because there's a lot of people in my profession who got their finger between their neck and their collar right now. I mean, the extent of error goes far beyond the science of random probability polling. I mean, we've known we've had some problems for a long time, because if you want to be able to take a sample of a population and then extrapolate the views of that sample back to the larger population from which the sample is drawn, the people who make up the sample have to be chosen on a random probability basis. That is, they all have to have the same equal chance of being chosen. So if you are an Italian Canadian, for example, and that represents 8% of the population, you have an 8% chance of getting interviewed. We no longer have a distribution system that allows us to get random probability samples, because we don't have a distribution system that reaches a universal suffrage population. I mean, when I started in the business, 100% of the population had landlines. Our response rates were 80%. Our results were stunningly accurate in the 1980s and the 1990s. Today, if you don't have the internet, then an internet poll doesn't reach you. If you don't have a landline doesn't reach you. Some have tried to get hybrid, but again, we have the one thing that we can't do is understand non-response. Response rates have gone down to about 8%. So the bigger firms, YouGov, Ipsos, are investing quite heavily in the science of sampling. The smaller guys have no chance of ever getting it right under today's circumstance. The additional issue here, within the discipline, we've also talked about something called social desirability. We can get virtually no one admitting that they're cheating on their spouse. We can find virtually no one confessing to drinking and driving last week. Until the last 5 years ago, we couldn't find anyone who claimed that they were anything other than heterosexual. And this notion that there's a socially desirable response is part of the bias of interviewing. Less so with online than in person, but there as well. There is some evidence that saying I'm a Donald Trump supporter in 2020 was not socially desirable. And as a consequence, that the pollsters were not able to get to, again, huge swaths of Americans who I think, Rod, as you suggested, might not like Donald Trump at all, but likes how aggressive he's been against China, or likes the fact that he stood up for the steel industry, or what have you. So that's all. Very long way of saying is that there's going to be some pretty serious introspection going on, and I think the polling industry is going to have to dig an awful lot deeper than they have for the media as of late.
And Alan, can I
Sure
ask one question of you as an observation? Because before the election, we talked about this, and I'd be curious your thought. It's also a change in how the campaign's operated. When we last talked, we never talked about the polls. As I said, the polls weren't worth paying attention to because the ground game each team was looking at was to identify people who don't vote. Democrats were trying to get
who weren't likely voters, whereas all the polls in the United States only look at likely voters.
Yes, if you only look at likely voters, you are by definition going to miss the 5 million people the Republican Party was trying to register. You're going to miss the 5 million young voters the Democrats were. And so you also took everything I think you just described and then ignored the strategy of the teams.
Yeah.
and that's how it is stunning that Senator Susan Collins never led in any major poll
ever
in the entire year, and she wins easily in Maine.
Well, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham were supposed to be in tight races. They both won by double digits. No, well beyond the bounds of error. Listen, for the balance of the conversation, I want to start from a premise that Joe Biden is going to be the presumptive president and eventually the elected president-elect, just for the purpose of the conversation. But before we start that, is there anyone who completely rejects that premise, saying that's a nutty thing to even talk about, that Donald Trump is going to get reelected for sure? Okay, then start. Okay, now we've got, even if Biden is declared president, Sarah, it looks like he's going to be facing a majority GOP Senate and an arguably ideologically divided Democratic House, not just Republican Democrat, but within the Democrat caucus itself. I mean, how untenable is the situation that he's in, and how able is he to pursue any kind of bold legislative agenda right now, given his situation?
Well, I mean, it's a good point, because I don't think that anything that's particularly transformational is going to take place in this administration. I think what we're going to see, and maybe I think there's an argument that this is really what needs to happen in the United States at this point anyway, are movements that are more incremental, that things that we can actually work together on, because he's going to have to, and Kamala Harris as vice president is going to have to walk into the Senate on day one and negotiate in good faith and with grace and humility with Mitch McConnell. And so that's going to be something that creates, two alternative paths. And one of those is marked with a sense of cooperation and healing and economic recovery and kind of post-pandemic actions as a priority. And the other is about furthering partisan gains and waiting for the 2022 election and then the 2024 election. So it'll really be up not just to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but it will also be up to Mitch McConnell, and it'll be up to the rest of the Republicans sitting in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So he does have a tough road to kind of walk down, and I think that what that does in many ways is force that campaign to look at its big goals and say which of these are attainable and which of these really are important for us to do out of the box. So how do we preserve and ensure that we've got healthcare that is going to go on continually and go past this administration, and be something that is, reliable for Americans. And I think that's going to be really important. Some of those issues are things that I think they'll be able to sit down and talk to the Republicans about and find a way forward on. And that will be something that's important to all the constituencies. One of the interesting questions is really briefly, because I'll answer it in here. Somebody asked if the Lincoln Project got everything that they were looking for. And in some ways, I think that that's part of it, right? So the Lincoln Project really was not about changing the United States from a Republican government to a Democratic government. It was about changing the presidency. And the people that are behind the Lincoln Project in many ways have this traditional Republican viewpoint that I think may end up finally being reflected in the Senate. But Democrats are going to have to be willing to forgive a lot of what's happened in these last 4 years, as a lot of those Senate Republicans really became agents of the Trump administration. So I think I'll leave it there.
I think there's a couple of points I'd like to pick up on there, Alan, if it's okay.
Sure, of course.
I think Sarah's making, in particular, two exceptional points. And I would just back up a little bit and say that for 24 years now, since the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, the American presidency has been a partisan battlefield. Clinton, up until that point, Clinton and Gingrich had been getting along reasonably well, and it was one of the more productive periods in terms of bipartisan, budget making in particular, but other legislation as well. But since then, we haven't seen much of it at all. I mean, Clinton was embattled for the remainder of his presidency. Bush, as soon as the war in Iraq became the main topic, was embattled. People talked about impeaching him and so on. Obama never had a clear shot. The Republicans were, including Trump, were challenging his very, legitimacy as a president. I mean, it was a bitterly partisan period, and so has the Trump presidency. So what we're talking about here did not start with Trump. He was just the latest champion of it. And what Sarah mentioned there, she doesn't see anything transformational, but then she proceeded to talk about something that would be transformational if it happened, which is that Biden and the congressional leadership, the Senate leadership in particular, find some path to working together to get some things done. It's been years since the American budget process was working properly. The American federal government budget process was working properly. There's a massive deficit that's developed and a massive debt load that's developed. These things are happening because there is no ability to conceive of both parties getting together and passing a budget.
I want to bring Rod in on that because part of the American divide is kind of the end of bipartisanship. No one ever reaches across the floor anymore. How likely is it that Mitch McConnell and the Republican-led Senate is just going to not play ball at all and even refuse to do things like confirm cabinet postings? I mean, is that a likely scenario going forward?
I think it's going to be very difficult for Biden to be able to get his cabinet seated quickly, easily. He would struggle getting any kind of judge through. McConnell's already even commenting on that. So if it's hard to get your cabinet in, you can imagine it will be hard on policy. At the same time, remember when the Obama-Biden team was in play, who was the problem solver? It was Biden. He was the guy who would go to the Hill and walk the hallway, talk to the senators, talk to the House members to actually broker a deal. And there's been turnover since then. He has a lot of existing relationships. Republicans do like Joe Biden. I mean, people personally like him. They do not find him to be somebody that is unreasonable. The question will be, can he broker a deal as he's talking to the Republicans that his progressive left will allow him to broker?
Right.
His problem is not just, can I get, 51 Republicans in the Senate to go along? Every time he makes that step, he's got to worry about 4 to 5 people on the left-hand side.
Well, expand on that, because that's really interesting. A lot of people haven't talked about that the pressures on him are coming not just from his opponents, but from the people in his caucus.
Look, In the last 72 hours, I've had a number of conversations with people talking about the fact that the word on the street, this is not official, is, they may not take anybody from the Senate into the cabinet. Well, there are reasons for that potentially. This is all speculative on my part, but it could be, well, they're trying to keep some arm's length from potentially an Elizabeth Warren Treasury Department progressive approach. Maybe they want to be more moderated than that. Well, if that was true, and I can't tell you that it is true, if that was true, imagine what the progressive base says. Well, wait a minute, we just had all the energy for the election. We just actually did all those small $25 donations. That was not the moderate Democrats, that was the progressive Democrats who gave that energy. They're going to go, you're going to box out potentially our advocates from being inside the game. So think of it just right off the bat of how do you stack out your cabinet. Then when you go to the policy front, there's a vote in the Senate you're trying to negotiate. You have a bunch of senators that are going to be very interested in making sure that the progressive base that either just elected them, maybe electing them in 22, where historically it's a challenge for the incumbent president's team. How do they negotiate that? So Biden is going to have to walk the line, but he may be the right guy because he at least does start with friendships and history with Republicans that maybe he can convert. And he is going to be the Democrat nominee, and it really doesn't do the Democrats any good to undermine him for their own purpose or policy. And I do want to just go to one thing Rick talked about, because I feel like this gets forgotten all the time, because people look at the years when Clinton was in as the end of bipartisanship. And I've always thought there was one reason that no one talks about, and that is because that happened to be the moment the Democrats lost hegemony over the House of Representatives for 50 years. No Republican ever, you had to deal with the Democrats. There was by definition a negotiation because you never dreamt you would have control and power. And so it was when the House became swingy that actually everyone started saying, oh, wait a minute, now we have to fight everything out because we might be able to get control of a body. But 50 years, 45 years of complete Democratic control meant every Republican president knew he had to deal with the House. There wasn't any question about compromise. Today, compromise may keep you from getting control of the body, and that's really driven, I think, a wedge in a lot of for both parties, both bases as they deal. So it's not just that people wanted to; it's they had to.
Sarah, that the issues that many claimed before the election was driving voting choice was the management of the pandemic. And there clearly is a very significant difference there. And even if a bold legislative path might not be available to Biden, there are executive orders. I'm interested in your view on how he will manage that pandemic differently, and especially what impact that would have on the Canada-US border restrictions.
Sure. I think first out of the box that a President Biden and a Biden administration would be collaborative with the state governments and the municipal governments. And that in and of itself would be a significant difference between how the Biden administration would manage COVID and economic recovery versus how the Trump administration is doing it right now. I also think that there would be a collaborative opportunity there for the Trudeau government and the Biden administration to talk about how to mitigate the effects of COVID, not just in the United States and Canada, but on a continental scale, and work towards some, interesting, and this is already happening in Canada to some extent, interesting ways to start to talk about reopening the border and reopening international travel into North America, and by using modified quarantines, by having some sort of testing regime for people that come in to the continent. Like, these are all things that I think you could have a conversation between a Biden administration and a Trump government or a Trudeau government that make sense overall for the continent, and that I don't think we can have right now. But I think the number one thing, and it's not about necessarily executive order, and it's not going to be about legislation, but it's going to be about cooperation and collaboration and finding ways that the federal government can support the states. And because really, when it comes down to something like a pandemic, it's affecting every region and every state differently. Sure. And it has to have some level of specificity there.
Now, Rick, we talked about this a little bit in the last webinar, but one of the biggest shared files between Canada and the US relates to energy and the environment, everything from Keystone XL to harmonizing emission standards between the two countries. What in that file is going to be most problematic for Canada-US relations going forward, and what should the government of Canada be looking at most deliberately to protect Canada's interests right now?
Specifically in the energy environmental sphere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the most immediate one will, if Biden ends up being inaugurated as president, is his promise to discontinue construction, to reverse the permit to construct Keystone XL. That construction is actually pretty well advanced, and it is actually only in addition to the existing Keystone pipeline. So that'll be complicated. The company is proceeding with construction. Alberta is financing that construction. So it'll be a flashpoint with President Obama President Biden early on, like almost immediately, because if he's going to cancel it, he pretty much has to do it right away, or it will be finished before he gets around to it. Maybe that would be the convenient thing for him to do, is to let it, get finished before he gets around to it. But I don't know what he'll choose to do with that. But that'll be a flashpoint between our two governments. The broader agenda, and the more permanent one, the more ongoing one, I mean, is about environmental and energy emissions, carbon emissions, and so on.
Yeah.
We're heading for a big meeting in Glasgow, COP26, the 26th anniversary of the first Council, or the Conference of the Parties, where Canada and the United States and everybody else is a part of that. I guess the first question is would a Biden-led USA re-engage with that process? I would expect yes. At that meeting, all of the countries are supposed, including Canada and the States, are to re-articulate our 2030 goals, but also interim goals, what's called interim goals, meaning where do we expect to be in 2025, 2035, 2040, which is actually a bit more complicated task, and of course politically quite important, quite sensitive in both of our countries. And if Canada and the States pursue that on different tracks, Canada has to worry about the effect of what's called leakage. If you have policies here that are designed to reduce emissions, does that just drive activity across the border? And so the jobs and so on are lost without any net benefit to the planet, to the climate. So, that's the more Canada and the States could get aligned on that, the better it would be for both of our countries. Easier said than done, but we've done it before on acid rain quite successfully, and other cross-border environmental issues. The recovery of the Great Lakes is a fantastic story. So
conventional wisdom is that Democratic House always gets to along better than a Republican House with the Liberal government. Think that's going to likely?
Yes, I do. I think, it's hard to imagine that the temperature doing anything but improve from the Trump era, because he was so, aggressive in terms of his approach to Canada on many fronts. So
I want to get into that difference in just a second, but first, Sarah, anything you've been monitoring there that you want to bring to the attention of the panel?
Yeah, there's a question that came in asking, what should we do in Canada to address the threats to our civic resilience, given the polarization south of the border and the porous nature of our cultural and social spheres? And I think that's a fair question, as we already saw earlier this summer, kind of the leakage of the civil unrest in the United States as it moved into Canada through the Black Lives Matter movement.
Rick, you want to touch on that? You touched on the cultural difference between the two countries a little bit, or the similarities. You see, start at just not the civil unrest side, but a political style. I mean, there's no question that Donald Trump, regardless of what you think about him, has got a very, very effective style of political communications. I mean, is that going to infiltrate itself into Canada? Will those who want to emulate that style of politics in this country?
Yes, I think it already has. I mean, if you look at the way Scheer campaigned and the way Aaron O'Toole campaigned for the leadership of the Conservative Party, there's a much more aggressive expression of, taking back control, taking back Canada. Well, from whom exactly? The loose description of liberals as socialists, which is, completely unfounded based on their actual policy program. Or corrupt, which is, has actually got specific meanings, which I don't think particularly apply. That kind of aggressive language has crept into Canadian politics, both federally and provincially. During the COVID stage, we're kind of backed off of a little bit, and we were never nearly as aggressive about it as the United States political climate has become. And I noticed that Aaron O'Toole, since he won the leadership, is not continuing that kind of aggressive positioning. And I think that's good. I think it's also reflected that the Canadian culture is not as receptive to that antagonistic, name calling, aggressive, baiting as I'm not sure how much Americans love it either. I mean, I'll let Rod and Sarah speak to that, but Canadians don't like it. It makes us uncomfortable. We'd rather find a way to get along. That's our basic nature. And politicians who try to be too much like Donald Trump, I get themselves short shrift in the Canadian body politic. There's an audience for it, no question, but not a big one.
Two-part question. The first part to Rod, and the second part to Sarah. I mean, we've suggested that the prospects of a bold legislative strategy or legislative program for Biden is limited for all the reasons that we cited. He faces a massive mountain of debt right now. He's pledged to have, I think, a $3 trillion green infrastructure program, probably unlikely. Is he just going to ignore that debt right now and try to follow a more progressive agenda in keeping with part of his caucus demands, or is he going to see some fiscal responsibility there?
This is my favorite question so far because I can give you a definitive answer. No one in DC cares about a debt anymore. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which team. We've spent money comfortably and blown through that line. Everyone likes to say they care. Everyone wants to say they're worried about that. But in reality, actions speak louder than words. And you can take it. It doesn't matter whether it's the Trump term, the Biden, Obama years. The government hasn't really cared about deficit spending in a very long time. And COVID is going to give you the rationale to not do so now, that we have to get the economy back up. So I think it's actually probably the perfect storm. I think there's probably going to be more liquidity generated by the government in 2021 than we've seen in a long time. And that may be bipartisan because, look, everybody wants to redo infrastructure, whether that's broadband, highways, pick whatever your definition should go into that. There's a lot of consensus that people think that needs to happen. Whether it's 1, 2, or 3 trillion, no one is talking about paid for trillion. It doesn't matter what size it is, right? So I think it's a perfect storm for a lot of spending.
The second part of the question, given what Rod's answer is, might not be quite as relevant as I thought it was going to be. But Sarah, I mean, one of the things that, while the cabinet in Canada is obviously continues to be focused on the management of the pandemic, I mean, they are also focused on recovery. And I'm just looking at this. I mean, do you see a Biden presidency, given all the dynamics that we've talked about, affecting our recovery planning in any way? I mean, should these guys start recalibrating what they were thinking before Tuesday?
Not really. I think that there's an appetite in Canada and in the United States both for kind of a circling of the wagons. And domestic production, focusing on domestic manufacturing, focusing on domestic production, focusing on, Canada First policy as much as there is an America First policy. And I think that, the Biden campaign platform had a lot of America First in it. It had a lot of procurement issues in it. It was actually quite isolationist and not necessarily, a platform that was rife in globalism. And I think that's true up here in Canada too. And we've seen this over the past few months that the Canadian government has worked to focus on domestic manufacturing. They've put in a lot of Buy Canada provisions into procurements that we had. There's new definitions on that so that it's a little bit more robust than it's been in the past. And I think that that's probably appropriate as you're trying to drive economic recovery in your respective economies. So, I mean, I think that there is always, I guess the question that I would ask the Canadian government is, did you really think a Biden administration was going to change your capacity for industrial strategy in any real fashion? Because I think the answer to that should be no.
Yeah, they probably were hoping, these guys are way more likely to do things like a green infrastructure plan, therefore lots more opportunity for Canadian investment. Canadian business. But one last area, and then I want to just kind of try to round up with all of you, Rick. I mean, one thing where the contrast was probably most sharp between Trump and Biden was Biden's commitment to multilateralism and kind of seeing the United States re-engage with the global community. But the fact of the matter is, for many Americans, is that Donald Trump's America First isolation is incredibly appealing. As part of what Rod was talking about, they might not like him, but they like the things he stood for. I mean, is Biden going to re-engage the United States with the multinational community? And if it does he run the risk of furthering the divide and inflaming the polarization in America than we've seen already?
Yes and yes, he will, and it may get inflamed. It would be too bad if it also gets inflamed. Trump, much as I don't particularly love the guy, as is pretty well known by anybody who knows me, is not always wrong. And he is right, for instance, about burden sharing with defense and security issues in NATO and so on. That's been well known for years. For 25 years, we've all been promising, all the other NATO members have been promising to spend a bigger share of the burden here. And we've, made promises, taken a Boy Scout vow with our other hand, fingers crossed behind our back, and never meant it, never came home and did anything about it. And Trump was not wrong to complain about that. He handled it in a bullying fashion.
Let's talk about Biden instead of going backwards. He will try to re-engage, and he will re-engage. Europe will be glad to have America back on the security front, on terrorism front, on the environmental issues, and so on. And the world will be a more stable place economically and in terms of security, with America participating in a more constructive fashion. So Biden, I believe, will do that. I think it'll be beneficial, and some people will say it's a bad thing. Coming up to 3 o'clock. So one last question for all of you, Rod, starting with you. I mean, given all that's transpired, what is your one key takeaway, and what are you going to be looking for going forward as an indicator of what's going to happen next?
The country is divided, and it actually probably comes down to, if you live inside something that looks like a beltway, you're probably a Democrat. If you live somewhere outside a beltway, you're probably inclined to be a Republican.
Yeah, the urban-rural divide is stunning, hey? I mean, just stunning.
I mean, every time CNN puts a chart up, you just look at it and you go, and just draw a beltway around it. It is what it is. There's nobody blue is winning predominantly rural districts, and vice versa. So the country is divided, but there are a couple of things, and this would maybe go back to value to the people listening to this. It builds on what Rick was just talking about. I do think there's going to be a lot of spending, and I do think there's going to be a lot of reintroducing the country back out to the international market, whether that's climate change, NATO, what have you. At the same time, there is strong bipartisan agreement around supply chain. And I think there will be people that suddenly say, we are prepared to mine again in the United States for rare earth minerals because we cannot depend on China to do so.
This is the North American supply chain, strengthening the North American supply chain.
Absolutely. Pharmaceuticals, minerals, you pick it. That is actually a common theme. And I wouldn't be surprised that it's hard for anybody to oppose that. And so we talk about infrastructure bills, we talk about spending. I would just call it supply chain. I think the place where there's a great opportunity to walk into, almost whether it's the farm belt or a manufacturing belt, for a Biden to walk into a senator, Democrat and Republican, and say, you have to be for this, don't you? And they'd go, yes. And they try to find ways to cobble that together. So I'm going to go with supply chain cohesion is probably something that fits both in the global narrative that Rick is talking about, that I agree with, as well as something that might be common ground. That'd be my one takeaway. But emotionally, the country is as divided as ever been, and this election did not resolve that.
Rick, last thoughts, key takeaway, what you're looking for going forward?
I think Canada's going to be keen to re-engage with the new administration, even whichever one it is, and try to get things on a better track. And it will be easier with Biden, no question. And if that's how this turns out, I think Canada's going to be moving quickly to say, okay, so where are you really vis-a-vis China, and how do we solve the issues that we share the effects of? how do we, is America interested in getting back involved in TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What are we going to do about emissions? Is there an a continental approach to these things? Can we agree on at least, 50% of it? I think that will be where we're going. And I think that it'll work more often than not, but it won't be perfect.
Last word to you, Sarah.
I think kind of picking up on some of the points that Rod made on supply chain resiliency, I think if Canada wants to move forward with the United States in any productive manner, Canada needs to work on focusing on really enhancing its own competitive resiliency in manufacturing and in resource management and in how it moves forward on climate change goals and in the innovation sphere. And I think that really the best way to really appeal to the United States is to prove yourself as a global competitor. Canada's consistently done that in the past. And I think that the more that it bolsters that, the better off it's going to be.
That's it for us. I want to thank Sarah Goldfeder, Rick Anderson, Rod Shaw for giving some smart talk for the last hour. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. Let you know that if we didn't get to a question that you put in the Q&A box there, we will provide a written response afterwards. We'll also send you a link to this conversation so that you can keep it and cherish it forever. And otherwise, we wish you all well and tell you to keep safe as we continue to try to paddle in uncharted waters. Thanks a lot. Take care.